Welcome everybody. This is another edition of Afikra Conversations. I'm very, very excited to introduce our special guest, Rana Abdelhamid. Rana is an Egyptian American who hails from Queens, New York, more than anything else. She is an internationally acclaimed community organizer, first-degree black belt, public speaker, and social entrepreneur focused on mass mobilization, international solidarity, and the empowerment of marginalized communities. For over a decade, Rana has served as the executive director of MALIKAH, or MALIKAH, I'm not sure how most people pronounce it, a global grassroots movement committed to building safety and power for all women through self-defense, healing justice, community organizing, and financial literacy. Rana's organizing work has been rooted in building solidarity across communities domestically and abroad. She's a prominent leader in the grassroots movement to call for Arabs to take a stand in support of Black lives. Rana has a BA from Middlebury in international politics and economics and a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. She was named a Truman Scholar and is one of the youngest serving board members of Amnesty International USA. Rana Abdelhamid, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk and to be in conversation.
Given that you're in New York right now, which in many ways is the epicenter of the Black Lives Matter movement right now, I guess the most important question to start with is, how are you doing right now? How are you today? What's your emotional, mental state right now?
That's a really kind and really complicated question. I think, you know, it's a challenging time. It's a challenging time for New York. It's a challenging time for my community in New York City, folks who I am in deep community with, who have experienced personally police violence, who are feeling triggered by this moment, but also who are connected to Black community, or who are Black themselves, who are feeling kind of the ways in which the police state has failed them in a really salient way. Not that this isn't something that folks are aware of, but just like the disregard for humanity and human life that we're seeing at a state level, both within the context of the pandemic, but also within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, is something that is definitely on my mind and definitely something that I've been involved with and trying to do my best with, while also taking care of my own mental health and taking care of my family and my loved ones. So it's a time. That's all I can say.
Well, I'm glad that you're feeling strong enough to be on this call at least, which is great. I want to sort of zoom back to Queens, just for those of us who may not be very familiar with Queens. Tell us a little bit about how you first became involved with community organizing when you were growing up in a neighborhood that you call, and I think many people call, Little Egypt in Queens.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I'm from Little Egypt. For folks who do not know about Queens, Queens is one of the most diverse places in the world. Something that we're really proud of is that we have over 800 languages that are spoken here, even languages that are no longer spoken in their countries of origin are still preserved and alive and thriving here in Queens. I grew up in a small neighborhood where my family first immigrated from Egypt to known as Little Egypt, which is in Astoria, Queens. And I grew up, you know, in a pretty working class, low income neighborhood where we, like many low income working class neighborhoods, experience various levels of police violence, experience various levels of housing insecurity, economic insecurity, that made community really the lifeline for our people, yeah. Right? Like we really relied on mosque institutions, cultural institutions, and community to be able to survive and feel safe during a time when it was challenging. And then when 9/11 happened, that heightened the challenge, where many members of my community were targeted, fathers deported, detained post 9/11 because of kind of this global war on terror that unfolded, that directly impacted Muslim New Yorkers in a very heavy way. And that's really where the peak of my organizing started. And then it just continued through the Arab Spring, where like a lot of the Egyptian diaspora was highly involved, and I became involved with that, and continued really into my involvement with racial justice, gender justice work, thinking about the own racialization of my identity, thinking about my own identity as a woman of color in the United States. So that's really where it starts. And I would like to also say that it's really rooted in love for my neighborhood, right? And love for my people, and a vision that I know is possible, that we can live in safety and we can thrive, and we could be connected and be in community.
Yeah, Queens sort of serves as this living, breathing example, right? To keep on looking at. And Astoria specifically, where it's just like, so the most, as they say, it's the most diverse zip code, right? Can you talk a little bit about founding WISE, which is now MALIKAH, and sort of what was the driving force behind that?
Yeah, for sure. So early on, I was involved again, like with different community organizations and institutions. And one of the things that I was deeply involved with was just a domestic violence shelter that was in my community. So I had an awareness of the different forms of violence that women experience. At the same time, was grappling with my identity as a Muslim woman, as a visibly Muslim woman. And when I was 16 years old, I experienced a hate-based attack, which was the moment that really sparked this deep desire that made me feel like there was a need for an organization like MALIKAH. I was assaulted by a man who tried to take off my hijab as I was walking down the streets, unfortunately in Queens. Fortunately was able to get away, but that moment left me feeling really vulnerable and really alone and really devastated by the reality of like feeling insecure in my own skin, right? Because of my identity. And after that, learned about hate crimes, like started to learn about hate crimes in New York, and learned that after 9/11, hate crimes against Muslims increased by 1,600%. And we know that that number is higher now because of the current administration. And so I, at the time, had been doing karate since I was very young. My Egyptian parents were like, go, you're too weak, go learn karate. And so I had been, training for a while. And so started kind of teaching girls in my neighborhood, like who are my friends, who trusted me. And I'd be like, come through. And they would come and I would like teach them, not even self-defense, but I would teach them karate. And then after each karate class, we would just like kick it, right? We would talk about what was going on at home. We would talk about our identities, kind of like the space you're trying to cultivate with a less like historic identity piece, right? But just like a safe space, which is I think the essence of what you're trying to do too. And during that time, like if you can imagine growing up between like a really conservative like immigrant culture and then like in New York, which is New York, while also dealing with the Islamophobia, there's various levels of challenges that a young woman might face. And so that became like a space for us really to thrive. So that's how MALIKAH was started. Now, at first it was like really just focused on Muslim women because those were the girls in my neighborhood, those were my friends. And now we're focused more broadly on brown and black women, engaging globally, not only teaching karate, but also teaching a more formalized form of self-defense and de-escalation, healing justice, financial literacy, and organizing. And our main vision is to build safety and power for women across the globe, to make it so that we don't have to feel unsafe.
Yeah. How do you think your program has sort of evolved from the early days, both it being centered in Queens and centered in that specific community to actually now, I was looking, you've trained more than 7,000 women, 18 different cities. Programmatically, how have you tried to shift it so that it is more of a global experience?
So much. Everyone who knows me, I'm always writing curriculum. We're always iterating on our curriculum almost every single year, because we're responding to the social justice landscape. We're responding to needs that we discover in our community. And I would say like at the same time though, the essence of it, being rooted in community, being connected in sisterhood, which is something that I learned growing up in Queens, like watching aunties in my neighborhood rely on each other and have this like informal network of sisterhood that became their lifeline when anything happened or anything popped off, was the model that still roots MALIKAH, which is how do we create these like networks of sisterhood across the globe where women can really rely on each other, where they could see themselves as social justice advocates, and they could see themselves as advocates for themselves with their communities to shift dynamics of power on a gendered level and on a racial level.
So I was reading online about you, and so you went to the Harvard Kennedy School, and you worked with Howard Ganz, who is this like acclaimed author and community organizer. Just for the people on the call who may be interested in some of the community organizing work that you do and would want to replicate some of the same foundational pieces to the communities that you've built, can you sort of speak just briefly about what you learned from studying and working with Mr. Ganz, and then like what some of those principles are, how it influenced the way you approach this?
Yeah, you know, it's so fascinating because I learned about Ganz before I went to the Kennedy School, about his public narrative framework, like literally on the streets in New York, and then like had the opportunity to go to the Kennedy School and then was able to study under him. And a lot of our framework in MALIKAH, like the curriculum that we deliver, is rooted in a lot of his pedagogy, which is something I deeply respect. And for folks who don't know, Marshall Ganz is a lifetime organizer who dropped out of Harvard when he was like 21 to go organize with farm workers, and then ended up organizing against segregation in the South. And he's like someone whose tradition of organizing is deeply rooted in his Jewish tradition and his own spirituality and faith. And because of that, a lot of his understanding around organizing is about relationship building, right? And it's about how do you build community and get to know people, but still directly related to strategic goals, right? And to a timeline and to metrics. And so it's a long-term framework. If someone were to look it up and want to better understand what the framework is that he talks about, he has something called the public narrative framework, which is really powerful. And it's called Story of Self, Story of Us, Story of Now. If anyone's heard Barack Obama's DNC 2007 speech, he uses that framework in his speech. Ganz actually helped him develop that speech, as well as like tools for one-on-one building, relationships and team building and strategy development. So there's a lot there.
So I realized that I said Howard Ganz. So I want to talk a little bit about this moment that we're in right now. And what I appreciate about you in my interaction with you, which haven't been that many like direct, when I sort of watch the way you work, is that I feel like you seem to always be checking yourself and trying to figure out, okay, what do I know? What don't I know? What power do I have? You know, where are my blind spots in general? What spurred you to co-author this piece, Arabs for Black Lives? And, you know, what did you learn in writing it? And what have you learned in the response to it?
That's a lot. Yeah, so it when the news first broke of Mr. George Floyd's murder, one of the things that I also learned early on was who was involved in calling the police, right? And we learned that unfortunately an Arab-owned store, an employee in the Arab-owned store was the person who ultimately called the police, that brought the police into the neighborhood, that then led to the murder of George Floyd. So for me, it was that reckoning of like knowing that I, as an organizer, right, like I work in the community of Little Egypt, working with a lot of small businesses, and really reflecting on like what role do Arab small businesses have in perpetuating and upholding these systems of oppression and systems of violence. And I know that particular situation could have been complex, but basically the point is like, I put that out and I got a lot of engagement that was really defensive, right, within the community. And I remember even like when I read that note, I was like, whoa, like I don't want to have anything to do with this. Like my brain was wanting to absolve myself and my community of anything that had to do with that. And I was like, I don't want to repost this. And I kept questioning myself, why don't I want to repost this? And that was the reason why I decided I have to repost it, right? Because it made me feel so uncomfortable to recognize and really reckon with the reality of anti-Blackness in my own community, that I was like, then that means I have work to do myself. And so part of pulling this together, these like 6 steps that Mafaz and I built, was really like even understanding the process of my own healing justice and how I would do the learning, and how I'm still doing the learning to check the anti-Blackness that I see manifest in my own household, within myself, within my community broadly, right? Because I think this is an ongoing journey. Anti-racism is work that we all have to commit to long term. And so that's where it really stemmed from. The responses are mixed, right? I think there's still the idea that, you know, folks, it's difficult. You want to absolve yourself, right? You don't want to engage. And so there's definitely folks who are like, we have nothing to do with this. This doesn't happen in the Arab world. The US history is different, which we know is not true. And then there are folks who really are trying to engage, who jumped on the opportunity to translate this, who are asking for more resources, who want to help in other ways. And so I think there's like 2 points and that are really important for us, 2 extremes. And I think it's important for us to think through why both happen as well.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for writing this. And because I think it's helped ground for some of us, or for people in the community who are trying to have this discussion with themselves, with their families, with their communities. It helped, at least to help me sort of ground myself and be like, okay, hold on, let me think about these things. Before we started the call, you and I were speaking briefly about how painful this process is. You know, as Arabs who, you know, at least since 2001 have felt even heightened sense of discrimination, particularly in the US. And definitely during the last few years, during the Trump administration, an even more heightened sense of discrimination. How when there is an opportunity to really realize that, oh wait, we may be even oppressing people whilst being oppressed. How have you been able to manage it or coach people through managing that process?
I think, you know, it's important to recognize that difficulty and to recognize that pain, right? It is a painful thing to realize that you are perpetuating violence. It's a painful thing to realize that you are doing harm, especially by the same systems that are doing harm to you. Like these are white supremacist systems that ethnic minorities, that religious minorities globally have to reckon with and deal with, and also experience violence because of, right? And so it is very challenging to tell someone who, for example, say is like a white passing Arab who wears the hijab and has her father detained because of X reason. And I'm like, but you have privilege because you're white passing, right? Yeah. Someone might be like, no, I don't have privilege. I'm Muslim. I'm wearing the hijab. My name sounds funny to people, you know, like all these reasons why I'm a minority. But it's important for us to also recognize that, like, and be able to name what is causing the various forms of oppression that we experience. And for many non-Black Arabs, it's not necessarily the racialization. It's not the race, right? It could be your ethnic minority status. It could be your religious minority status. Mm-hmm. And you could hold both those truths. You could hold the truth of, yes, I experienced violence and oppression because of white supremacy, but also I might perpetuate white supremacy. Yeah. And I might be upholding white supremacy in this ways. And then that's actually really powerful, because then you realize, well, I got to stop perpetuating white supremacy so that white supremacy can be defeated and so that we're all safe, right? And then it makes you realize that actually, truly, our liberations are all tied, right? And that we won't all be free unless all of us are doing the work to free all of us.
And like, all of us are capable of bigotry, right? We're all deeply capable of bigotry and ignorance. And so we have to combat it in every single corner of ourselves. I think that's really interesting, also within the context of the Arab world, right? Where sentences like white supremacy don't really have the same ring to them. And so I think the work that you've done here, the way it's sort of ringing in the Arab world, is also really really powerful. Have you noticed communities in Egypt that you might be directly related to or be in direct touch with? Have they reacted to this work differently, like in a surprising way for you, or?
Yeah, and it's very interesting the language piece that you bring up, because even linguistically,
Yeah.
it's been fascinating to see how people respond, even to the word aswad, right, or like sud, right? So
Yeah.
even saying Black Lives Matter, translating Black Lives Matter into Arabic, people are like,
Yeah.
whoa, you did not just call someone black, right? Like saying or categorizing black is offensive. And so even unpacking that, like why is saying black in itself for you and your perception seen as something that is offensive, right? When
Yeah.
this is how folks who are organizers on the ground in Egypt or organizers in the Middle East and North Africa doing work around anti-Blackness, this is how they self-categorize, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's seeing that kind of response of really trying to be like, well, that's an American problem. That's one thing. The language bit is another thing. I think the other thing is like, well, we don't really mean that. Well, it's not that systemic, is another thing. And I also think the thing that's really important to also think about is that it's not just the colorism, right? It's not
Yeah.
just the language is really violent, and we should, that's something that we definitely should talk about. But there's also structural violence that manifests in the Middle East and North Africa as well that is connected to anti-Blackness, right? And we could talk about, like, for example, some folks have been bringing up the kafala system, right?
Yeah.
Folks have been talking about, you know, how the distribution of resources to refugee communities manifests, right?
Yeah.
Sub-Saharan
Of course.
Africans versus Syrian migrants, right, or refugees. People talk about like the way in which anti-violence manifests, like even when you're walking down the street, or distribution to certain villages, right, in certain communities of Egypt. We know the displacement of Nubians has been like a huge thing, right, or from their land. So there are structural histories that we need to think about, and not just focus on what colorism is the issue. Yes, it is an
Yeah.
issue, and that's real, but there's also these like deeply rooted challenges that we also need to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was listening to this interview with Bakari Sellers, and he was just like, you know, it's really important to talk about how we feel, right? That is important, but just also talk about the history. Just read a book. Just like set your feelings aside and set anyone's feelings aside, and let's actually understand the history of things. Which is what you're speaking to, which I resonates with me overwhelmingly. You know, so speaking of that, I'm curious how this work resonates with like the enormous amount of other work you're doing. So like when you write, so you co-edited this book, or you compiled and edited this book, Muslim Women's Stories. When you do that work, right? You publish this book. Do you feel like? I guess what I'm asking is, I had Zahra Hankir on the show 2 days ago, and she wrote this book, Are Women on the Ground, which was a compilation of 19 Arab female journalists who are reporting on conflict in the Arab world over the last few decades. And I was asking her who is this book for? And I was really curious when I saw this book, who do you think this book was for?
Yeah. So when we compiled this book and wrote this book, it's
Yeah.
for Muslim women.
Yeah.
That's our primary audience.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to what you're saying in terms of history, right?
Yeah.
When the narratives around Muslim women are oftentimes written by not Muslim women, that's what Hijabis of New York was about too. It was about like, how do I preserve this moment in history, and how do I preserve the narratives of really powerful Muslim women and the things that they're kind of dealing with in the West, like in the US specifically, and be able to capture the diversity of our experiences through our voices. And it was about like, you know, I want to be able to look back and say, this was a moment in time in how, what the challenges Muslim women were dealing with, and what they were doing, and be able to like reference directly the words of Muslim women. without needing to pontificate, right, and hypothesize out of thin air, which is oftentimes what we fall victim to.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. Like literally handing the mic to somebody saying, "You tell your own story, you tell your own history." I think that's super, super powerful. I want to open it up to the audience because I think there's going to be some really good questions. But before we do, I want to just ask you these sort of quick fire Q&A, and then we'll let the audience go until you have to jump off. So real quick, what are you reading and watching right now, or watching right now?
So so the book that I'm reading is The Return by Hisham Matar, and I'm sure many people have like read this book. One of my really close friends just moved back to Libya, where many folks probably know there's civil war there. And so I've just been trying to get a deeper understanding of like the context of the political situation. I did want to highlight a book that I just heard about through a Scene Arabia article that my friend and I are starting to read together, that I haven't started reading, but it's called A Different Shade of Colonialism: Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of the Sudan. It's by Eve Trout Powell. And the reason why I highlight that book is because I think, we don't talk a lot, Egyptians don't talk a lot about the history of the creation of the Egyptian nation state vis-a-vis the colonization of Sudan, right? And like the ways in which like our relationship with Sudan actually sometimes and does, right, have a lot of anti-Blackness. And so that's another book that I just heard about and I would recommend to folks too.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Okay, so when I was growing up, one of my first mentors in organizing was a woman called Tenjiwe Mikaris, who now leads the Movement for Black Lives movement. And I remember when I was young, like I would literally, a lot of my life as a young organizer was following her around and learning so much from her. And I really wish that this is something I could do now, even though she's like so busy. But she's someone that I would suggest folks follow her work by following Movement for Black Lives. And I'm happy to like put her name in the message too, but someone super inspiring.
Yeah. Great. What do most people misunderstand about your work or your profession?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't really know what organizing is. Like, I think like, I tell, for example, like some members of my family and they're like, you organize? Like you organize? Like they think I'm like a secretary and I'm like, no, that's not what
including,
I do.
Very famously, including Sarah Palin.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, so people don't really, I think there is a lot of misinformation around activism, right? Like they think you just show up on the streets, you protest, and then you go home, and not really a deep understanding of like what goes before that, what's the strategy. And so much of organizing is people work. It's the work of like sitting down and reflecting on like your own positionality. It's the work of bringing your community along to understand like and have awareness around politics and political education. It's so much education work. So I wish more people understood how much like just one-on-one conversations, how much reading, how much strategy goes into organizing.
Amazing. Whose work do you admire and are inspired by?
So not to, toot the horn of MALIKAH, but I really admire and I feel inspired by the women who are leading like a lot of the work that MALIKAH does. We have a network of women organizers across the globe who do work that, you'll never see on TV, but is work that holds down their communities. And I'll just give you an example, like one woman who's from Chinatown, who's doing a lot of work, just trying to get one woman elected to the business community board in Chinatown, where there's a lot of gentrification happening in New York. Another woman who does a lot of maternal mortality, work around maternal mortality of Black women in North Carolina. There's a doula. So there's like so many of these women who I feel so inspired by because they're rooted in a community, right? And they really just service the folks around them out of love for the people that they're serving.
Awesome. Amazing. Okay, I'm going to open it up to everyone. The order of questions, Philip, you're first, and then I'll type in everybody else's questions in order. So Philip, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, I have a question. It's a little bit off topic, but you happen to mention that you spoke with the merchant who received the $20 bill. I was wondering if you happened to find out whether or not it was in fact a fake $20 bill or real, and anything else you'd like to say about what you learned about from the transaction between the two people. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So I actually, just to clarify, I didn't speak with the merchant directly or the store owner directly, but I know, for example, Linda Sarsour, who's an activist in the US, wrote a bunch about her conversations with him. She was on the ground in Minneapolis. And in her engagement with the store owner, it turns out that the store owner was indeed not in the store, but it was a store policy for him to call for his employees to call police if there was a fake $20 or fake counterfeit money. I don't know what the outcome was. I'm not sure if the bill was fake or not fake. I think the main point the activists are trying to make around thinking about the role of store owners, especially when we talk about Arab and Asian store owners in predominantly Black communities, is the ways in which many of these store owners, uphold different levels of anti-Blackness through their engagement with police and through their automatic criminalization of the community. I mean, I was on a call the other day with a woman who talked about, even in Dearborn, there's an Arab store owner who makes little kids who are like in elementary school, middle school, stand outside the door of his store in a line, not letting them in, lets them in only like 2 or 3 at a time because he's afraid that they're going to steal things. Like things like this, beyond, engagement of police, where there's an automatic assumption of criminality when there's engagement with Black communities. So the point of that conversation and point of engagement was like, how do we actually do the work to educate and to engage store owners with all of the responsibilities that they hold to their community, to actually build deeper community and connection with the communities that they serve, as a form of diverting police engagement as the priority point of engagement when challenges do arise.
Yeah, it's also one of those questions, or one of those sort of those details that's like besides the point, It's really important, whether it was or wasn't. That's not really the problem here. Okay, thanks, Philip. Maha, then Maisa, then Julia. Maha, you're up.
Hi, Mikey, and hi, everyone. Yeah, I actually have 2 questions, so I'm sorry for adding a second one. But my first question was, do you have any suggestions or how do we welcome Black Arab content creators and Black Arab voices into these Arab spaces? I think particularly as an Egyptian American in all of the Arab American spaces that I am a part of, both in DC and on the West Coast, there's not a ton of those voices. And I think that's for a particular reason, and I think we don't do a good job of welcoming those voices. So I would love to hear kind of some concrete examples with keeping in mind that, I don't want to force them to educate us. And I think that's a really big portion of it. And then my second question is something that I've noticed in this particular time, and I think just in any time of like intense social justice, is kind of the immersion of new activists, and seeing a lot of people use the platform or the time to become an activist. I've always had concerns and worries about, there's a lot of people like you who have been doing this work for a long time and have spent a lot of time and energy. How do we kind of redirect the resources to those people instead of kind of focusing on these new spaces and these new people instead of, taking up more space? That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Maha. So to your first question, I think you know, I think the way we should think about engagement of Black folks into, or Black Arabs, Afro-Arabs into just Arab spaces in general, which we know, you're so right. Like anytime I've ever been to an Arab event, it's very rare that I will find an Afro-Arab represented in the space, or Afro-Arabs in the space. Is that first is like, before we try to bring folks in, how are we making sure that these spaces are going to be safe, right? When you are bringing folks in, because you don't want to be like, all right, I'm just gonna fill this event with like every Black Arab, and then they come in and then they're constantly having to educate, they're experiencing racism. And I talked about this a couple of days ago, but I went to a conference a couple of years ago. I brought one of my Black friends to this conference. He experienced racism like 5 times in the conference, like blatant aggression. People were constantly asking him like thought he was like working in the space, like things like that, thought he was working in the space, question why he was there. And he has an understanding of the fact that there are Afro-Arabs, so there's like no reason why he wouldn't be there, right? And so I remember like then after being in that space being like, wow, I'm never gonna bring a friend around into the space again because I don't feel safe for them. Like I'm like, they're not gonna be treated with respect. Like why should I bring them into this? And so I think Arab spaces that don't have Black voices, don't have Black leadership, need to think about what are they doing to restructure, to do their own education, to make sure that they're constituency based, that their community is going to be doing and committed to doing anti-racism work. And then 2 is like, who's the leadership? Who are the holders of power, right? If your board, if your panel, if your leadership team and executive team all looks exactly the same, then you know the people who are going to show up are also going to be because we invite people who look like us, right? Or we invite people who we might feel comfortable around, right? We don't want to make mistakes around, or we might be afraid to make mistakes around. And so questioning those things, so like who's holder of power, how are we making the space safe and committed to anti-racism, and then the last thing that I will say is like something, for example, MALIKAH is committed to, is like if we're going to commit to doing better work, and we're going to want to do education work, and we're going to host a panel, right? Or if we're going to try to do any consultant, is like you should pay people for their labor, right? And I think a lot of institutions right now are like, well, I'll just bring in this person to like do this panel, but it's like Black folks are tapped out. You should pay them if they're going to speak about anti-racism, if this is their profession or this is their identity and they feel comfortable sharing it. So those are the things that I'll highlight. And then I can't remember your second question. Oh, the new activist versus organizer. Yeah. I think, first of all, like as an old-time organizer and as an activist, I'm actually super excited that there are so many people who are talking about this, because I feel like before I would talk about racism in the Arab world and like Arab spaces, and people would be like, what? You know, like we don't have to talk about this. But now it's like everyone wants to talk about it, which is something for me. I'm like, finally, right? And I think a lot of activists are feeling the finally. So I would say 2 things. One is like supporting organizations, right? Not individuals. So if you were to support, like I would never be like, support my work. I would always be like, support an organization like MALIKAH, right? Like very local, grassroots, that has a network of community members that are involved. Because then you know, like these institutions have been doing the work, have been in community. And you could see that with like BYP 100, right? Like organizations that have been on the ground doing the work. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing is creating more space where you are creating that like cross learning, right? Where, because burnout can happen with new activism, and then, but also recognizing that folks have been doing the work as well is important to me as someone who has been in this space. Those are the things that I would say. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's great. Thanks, Maha. Maisa?
Hi, guys. Thank you, Rana. This has been really interesting, and you're doing amazing, amazing work. My question is, like, aside from local initiatives right now, and like, I don't want to, I suppose saying local initiatives kind of, you know, makes it seem smaller than it is, but like Black Lives Matter in the US, Black Lives Matter in the UK, specific issues such as kafala in Lebanon and things like that, like specific targets. Do you think there's more we can do as a global Arab community? Like everyone's educating themselves and trying to challenge families and communities, but do you think that there's space for us to organize together on a diaspora kind of level, but including those Afro-Arab voices and kind of like giving them those spaces as well? Because I mean, so much of this resonates with our own regional like liberation movements, and I suppose we can try and learn from those moments as well. Or do you think it's better to focus on the local?
I mean, I think it's, first of all, thank you so much for your question, Maisa. And also thank you for the work that you're doing as well with some of the initiatives around Arabs for Black Lives. I think it's both. I don't think it's either and. I think it's where you personally feel, or where an individual personally feels like they should be investing their time. Right now in this moment, I know what Black organizers are calling for in the US, right? They're calling for defunding police, which is like the primary call to action, and divesting those resources and reinvesting them into community services, social services, education, specifically for Black communities. So if I were to say, like, what is our call to action? Like, what should we be doing right now as non-Black Arabs, as Black Arabs, right? As people of color, immigrants, whatever it might be, is demanding locally defunding from police. And that could be like at a city level, and that could also go nationally and globally as well. And educating on that, right? So even if you're global, like what is the pressure that you can do to like create education and awareness around the policing system in the US, which is deeply rooted and entrenched in the enslavement of African people historically. And so this is something that I would say in terms of prioritization when you're feeling stretched. I think when you're thinking about long-term strategy, right, there are multiple things that we could think about, and I think like if you're connecting it to what the ask is here in the United States, we know that the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex is a global system. We know, for example, the connection between Israel and the training of police officers in the United States, and there could be like a really huge role that Afro-Arabs, the Afro-Palestinians, that non-Black Arabs, non-Black Palestinians can play in really diverting resources and stepping down on that demand of not engaging with the Israeli government in this type of militarization of police, right? And I think following the lead of that call to action, so centering that call to action, and then letting is about strategic organizing or long term, as you're continuing to do some of the local initiatives and the education work, right? And calling out all this stuff is super important as well.
Okay, great. We have one last question, Julia. If let's try to, we're almost, we're going to try to end 5 minutes before the break.
Hi everyone, thanks Rana for being here, and hi Mikey, I hope you're well. My question has actually developed, it's now twofold, sorry, so the 5 minutes early thing might not, just might not happen, but let's see. So my first question is more around sort of the conversations that we're having. I'm a little bit concerned that a lot of the conversations we're having are within spaces that are already quite safe. We're talking to our friends, we're talking to our people, even like with my family at this point, with my mum, like she's on my side. I've got her there. How do we break into those communities that are more maybe quite socially conservative? They're a bit more in a bit of a bubble in a way, especially communities where some of their leaders have are anti-Black, and those are kind of some of the things that they talk about very openly. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that. And my second question is a quick one. I don't know about the US, but in the UK, I've had conversations with friends about, I feel a bit of a lack of representation from Arab leaders about this conversation. And I'm facing a lot of pushback and a lot of like difficult conversations, and it's quite tiring. But I was wondering how you look after your mental health in all of this, and how do you look after yourself? And although it is tiring, it is obviously much more tiring for Black people But I do feel when we have our conversations too, those are difficult, and we need to have that balance too. So I was wondering if we could have your insight into that.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much for those questions. I'll answer the mental health one second. So in terms of engaging community, I just want to point out, like, as an here's the other misconception that I wish people didn't knew about organizers. So, like, the tip of the work is on social, right? Like, most of the work is me, like, texting the imam of my local mosque to try to get him to talk about anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter, and getting him only to talk about Black Lives Matter, but not on anti-Blackness, and then still working, you know? And so there's an initiative right now that a group of organizers in New York City are involved with, where we're trying to get, on a very grassroots level, calling up, literally, like, on the phone with imams, being like, hi, there's a petition we want you to sign to defund police, talking to them for like 40 minutes to an hour about, like, what this means, and getting them to sign on to this, and having that conversation, right? And being engaged, again, relationship building, understanding, like, what they're challenged by, why they don't feel comfortable signing on to this. We're having conversations, for example, like, one of the co-organizers I'm working with, she works with Yama, like, she's been, which is the Yemeni American Merchants Association. She's been, like, on calls with them, trying to understand people's perspectives around their engagement with police. What are their fears as merchants, right? And many people, like you said, right, already come with some of their biases, their sentiments around anti-Blackness, their experiences in the community, oftentimes feeling unsafe and thinking that, you know, that because of their experiences, they're kind of absolved from having some sort of responsibility. But it's that slow conversation of bringing your community, right, and calling them in. So I think like, those conversations need to happen. They're happening locally. They're not that visible, right? So you might not see them, and you might not put them out, right? So if you decide, actually, I'm going to go and I'm going to speak to these local institutions that I'm a part of and make sure they're talking about that, this is super important, right? Even if it's not going to make a huge social splash. So that's what I would say. And then the second thing is, I actually think that these conversations, surprisingly, most of the conversations I feel like that have around social justice do happen in silo, but I think I've been getting a lot of pushback on this because I think Arabs have not reckoned with the different constructions of our racial identity, right? Like, I have not been in spaces where white passing Arabs call themselves out and say, I am white passing, or brown Arabs call themselves out for their racial privilege, right? So I think this is something that is just starting to happen. And for me, that even in liberal, progressive, leftist spaces is a new type of language that we're beginning to see and beginning to use, which is super important. So that's what I would say to that. And then the second thing on self-care, I mean, I'm again rooted in my community with MALIKAH. We do breathing exercises every time we get on a call. They're really my sisters. I think being part of an organizing community that you feel really connected to and plugged into, that is your sisterhood. And I know sometimes that's hard to find, has been, like, the most important thing for me. And plus, just, like, being with my family and being with people I love and remembering to unplug. Like, sometimes I'm like, all right, I'm leaving my phone for 4 hours and I'm not gonna touch it this one night. And then I lie and then I get on it. But then at least I was off it for 2 hours. So this is what I try to do in terms of mental health.
Rana, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have to jump off. This has been enormously enlightening. And thanks for all the work you're doing. I hope I see you sometime soon, and I hope maybe see you on a call soon.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
And thanks for listening.